Hey guys. So King James VI of Scotland was notorious for being rude in church, often talking to those around him while the preaching was going on. One Sunday he was sitting in the royal gallery with some of his courtiers, and Robert Bruce was preaching. The king was chatting away to his people, and so Bruce stopped preaching. The king fell silent and looked at Bruce, and Bruce began to preach again, and once again the king began to talk, and again Bruce stopped speaking. This pattern was repeated 3 times. The 3rd time that Bruce fell silent, he spoke directly to the king. It is said to have been the expression of the wisest of kings. When the lion roars, all the beasts of the field are quiet. The lion of the tribe of Judah is now roaring in the voice of his gospel, and it becomes all petty kings of the earth to be silent. Wow. We're beginning the story of Saul today, and we're in 1 Samuel chapter 9. Israel has asked for a king. God is going to give them a king eventually, but it is supposed to be one of his choosing and in his time. But Israel wanted a king now. They wanted this so that they could be like the nations around them. And instead of God being their protector and the one who would lead them into battle, they wanted someone tangible and visible, one that made them like the other nations. And so God told Samuel to give them what they requested. There was a well-known man of the tribe of Benjamin named Kish, and he had a son named Saul. And Saul was impressive. He was tall, and there was no one else quite like him. He certainly looked like a king. When we meet Saul, he's out looking for some missing donkeys. His father's donkeys have gone missing. He has a servant with him, and he's seeking them. And he wanders about a bit, trying to find them without success. And it all seems kind of random and fruitless, but he's actually being maneuvered by God to just the right place to meet Samuel, or really, to meet God. Saul thinks that they need to go home, so his father doesn't start worrying about the 2 of them, but the servant suggests they ask the seer, which was what they called a prophet in those days, and that was in the town near where they were. And they have a bit of silver, and they can give us a gift, and they're going to go and ask the seer, Samuel, about the donkeys. So they go to the town, and they find Samuel just going up to a place where there's a feast to be held, and he was going to bless the sacrifice. The Lord had told Samuel that a Benjamite was coming, and he was the one that was to be anointed king over Israel. So when Saul and his servant come to Samuel, he invites Saul to eat with him. And then the next morning, he speaks to him about what is in his heart. But right off the bat, he tells Saul he is the one to whom Israel's desire has turned. Saul doesn't understand what this is about. In the morning, Samuel asks Saul to send his servant on ahead while Samuel gives Saul a message from the Lord. Then Samuel pours oil on the head of Saul and anoints him the leader over the Lord's inheritance. He then gives Saul some signs that this is of God. He tells them that he's going to meet 2 men near Rachel's tomb, and they will tell him that the donkeys have been found and his father is now worried about him. After that, near a big tree, he's going to meet 3 men carrying some items, and they are going to give him 2 loaves of bread, which he is to accept. Then he will go on and he will meet a group of prophets. And when he is with them, the Spirit of the Lord is going to come upon him and he is going to prophesy. He will be changed. He will be a different person. Once that has happened, Samuel says, whatever you find to do, for God is with you. But Samuel says, I'm going to meet you in Gilgal, and I will sacrifice burnt offerings and fellowship offerings, and you are to wait 7 days till I come and tell you what to do. So all of these things happen. Saul meets the people described. He prophesies with the prophets. He is empowered by the Spirit of the Lord. Now, Saul did not tell his family that he has been anointed king. Perhaps all of this seems just too bizarre, but God has given him a new heart. God is giving Saul everything he needs to succeed as king. Saul just needs to obey the Lord. God didn't want Israel to have a king yet, but God is not leaving Saul without what he needs to do the job well. He gave Saul the word of the Lord through Samuel, and he gave him power through the Spirit. So Samuel gathers the people to Mizpah to remind them of the history of God's leadership and provision for them. He's going to introduce them to their new king. He told them that they had rejected their God and asked for a king, and so now they're going to gather before the Lord. And there is a selection process by which he is showing the nation who God has selected. And we're not told how each tribe or family or clan is identified, but this is very similar to what happened when the Lord went through the nation to identify Achan as the one who had taken items from Jericho and brought defeat on Israel at Ai. So this is a God-directed process. First, the tribe of Benjamin is chosen, then the clan of Matri, and finally the family of Kish and his son Saul. But there's a problem. They can't find Saul. He was selected, but where is he? An inquiry is made to the Lord. Has this person, Saul, that you selected, is he even here yet? And the Lord said, yes, he's hiding in the luggage. Now, I always thought that was kind of a funny scene. Here's this guy they have chosen as king that they want, and he's hiding among the suitcases. But when he stood up and the people saw him, they saw how tall he was and how impressive looking, and the people shouted, "Long live the king." Now, there were regulations for kingship, regulations the Lord had laid down in Deuteronomy 17, verses 14 to 20. And Samuel wrote these down for Saul and gave them to him, so he was not in any doubt as to how he is to live this role before the Lord. So Saul went home. Now there were some who were in support of him and some who were not. Benjamin was not really a very significant tribe, and some people thought that the king should have come from somewhere else. God had chosen the unexpected. Not all the people were on board with Saul as their new king. Now in chapter 11, there's a terrible situation for the people of Jabesh Gilead. The Ammonites have besieged it. The people of Jabesh Gilead want peace. They want to make a treaty with those who are besieging them, but the enemies say that they will only make a treaty if every person in Jabesh Gilead's right eye is gouged out. The leader of the Ammonites is a man who loves to cause pain and to watch people squirm and suffer. And the people of Jabesh Gilead ask for 7 days to see if anyone will come to their aid and help them. And they send messages throughout the nation asking for help. When the message is received, the people weep and they're very upset. Saul hears and asks what's going on. And when he hears the story, the power of the Spirit of the Lord comes over him, and he burns with anger toward the Ammonites. He musters the nation with firm commands, threats really, and he goes to rescue Jabesh Gilead. God gives them a massive victory over the Ammonites, and this great victory establishes Saul as king. There were some who wanted to kill those who had opposed the rule of Saul, but Saul won't allow it, and so he is confirmed as king. Samuel speaks to the nation. He reminds them of his years of service to them. He said that never has he cheated any of them or taken anything from any one of them or oppressed them. And they agree that he has done none of those things. He then speaks to them about their history with the Lord. And he says again that they have sinned in asking for a king. But he says the Lord is not going to leave them. I'm just going to read a couple of verses from chapter 12, verses 14 and 15. Where are we? If you fear the Lord and serve and obey him and do not rebel against his commands, and if both you and the king who reigns over you follow the Lord your God, good. But if you do not obey the Lord, and if you rebel against his commands, his hand will be against you as he was against your ancestors. Having a king does not change the Lord's commitment to them, but only if they do not turn against him. Samuel then says that to prove to them that it was an evil thing to ask for a king, it's going to thunder and rain on the wheat harvest. Now, this would, of course, have devastating economic results. And it happened. And the people stand in awe of the Lord and of Samuel as the wheat is destroyed by this rain. They are fearful because they've sinned in asking for a king. So let's go back to chapter 12 and read verses 19 to 20, and then drop down and read 22. The people all said to Samuel, "Pray to the Lord your God for your servants, so that we will not die. For we have added to all our other sins the evil of asking for a king." "Do not be afraid," Samuel replied. "You have done all this evil. Yet do not turn away from the Lord, but serve the Lord with all your heart." Verse 22. "For the sake of his great name, the Lord will not reject his people, because the Lord was pleased to make you his own." God is going to rescue them and stay with them as long as they obey him for the sake of his own name and not because they deserved it. Samuel then just goes on to say that though they have rejected the Lord, he himself is still assigned to pray for the people. And you can read that down here in verse 23. "As for me, far be it from me that I should sin against the Lord by failing to pray for you. And I will teach you the way that is good and right." Samuel exhibits the same mercy toward the people that the Lord has for them in spite of their sin. God is still all in for his people, and so too is his prophet Samuel. Saul has begun well. God had not wanted them to have a king yet, but he gave them what they requested, an impressive man as king, and God gave that man all he needed to be successful. God changed his heart and gave him the Spirit of God, and God would continue to give direction to Saul through Samuel. Saul can be a successful king, a great king, if he obeys the word of the Lord. When God calls, he sets up the called one for success. Did God know that Saul would fail? Sure he did. But he wouldn't fail because God set him up to fail. On the contrary, God set him up to succeed. And Saul began well. God sought out Saul. It was God who put Saul on that wandering path into the collision course with Samuel. His meandering path looking for missing donkeys was not an accident. It was not wasted time. Sometimes it looks to us as if on the meandering path we're on is a waste of time, but it actually puts us in the place where God can call us or use us. What set of seemingly random and wasted events are you feeling discouraged about in your life? Will you trust God that it's not wasted at all? Saul was hiding when he was confirmed as king. Maybe he was a bit overwhelmed at the idea of the task. Perhaps he's hoping he could avoid the whole thing. This was not really an easy situation for him. What call has God given to you and you're trying to avoid it? Maybe to hide from it. God knows where you are and he will persist in his call. You can say no. You can hope no one notices you, but you can't hide from God. A few years ago, I asked someone to be a leader in a BSF class I teach. She had had a sense for quite a while that God was going to ask her to do this, and she didn't want to. So she had deliberately taken a job in her church so that it would be impossible for her to say yes to being a BSF leader because she worked on the day that we had leaders training. She was trying to avoid God's call. And yet here I was, not knowing any of that, asking her to be a leader. Her job circumstances changed, not of her doing, but that of her job, so that she was no longer able to say that she was unavailable and it was impossible for her to lead. And she realized God was insisting that she do what he called her to do. So she said yes to being a leader. God doesn't call the super equipped. He often calls first and then shows us how we will be equipped. He wants our obedience. Well, in spite of his strong beginnings, Saul begins to go downhill fairly early in his reign. In chapter 13, Saul had split his army into 3 parts. There were 2,000 men with him, 1,000 with his son Jonathan, and the rest of the army he had sent home. And Jonathan took his small group of men and attacked a Philistine outpost in Geba. And this caused the Philistines to gather and declare war on Israel. The Philistines had 3,000 chariots, 6,000 charioteers, and so many soldiers they were like sand on the seashore. Israel sees this situation and are very overwhelmed. They run and hide in caves and among the rocks and in pits. And some of them even flee the land totally. This seems to have come on Jonathan and his little band of men, while Saul, the king, and his 2,000 men are in Gilgal, quaking with fear. It also seems that Samuel was supposed to come, perhaps to give Saul direction from the Lord. Samuel didn't show up when he's expected, and Saul didn't wait. Instead, he offers sacrifices to the Lord himself. When Samuel comes, he asks what Saul has done, and Saul has tons of excuses why it was not his fault. He says, well, the men were running away, and so clearly something had to be done. He blamed Samuel for not coming when he was expected. The Philistines were gathering against him, and he needed to seek the Lord, and so he offered sacrifices which he was not allowed to do because he's not a Levite. And Samuel reprimands him. This is in chapter 13, and I'm going to read a couple of verses starting at verse 13. You have done a foolish thing, Samuel said. You have not kept the commands the Lord your God gave you. If you had, he would have established your kingdom over Israel for all time. But now your kingdom will not endure. The Lord has sought out a man after his own heart and appointed him ruler of his people, because you have not kept the Lord's commands. There were consequences to Saul's disobedience. The worst part, which is in verse 15, which I did not read, and Samuel left Gilgal and went to Benjamin without giving a word from the Lord to Saul about the Philistines. Saul has been left with no guidance from God. He refused to wait for God, and he acted in self-will, and so the Lord left him to his own resources. The situation is tough. There are raiding parties coming from the Philistines to Israel, and Israel has no weapons. The Philistines had enough control at that time that they had removed all blacksmiths from inside the nation of Israel. The Israelites had to go to Philistine territory to buy farming implements. But that meant that the Philistines could make sure that the Israelites did not buy weapons. Only Saul and Jonathan had a sword. And so we begin chapter 14, and there's a group of Philistines, a raiding party, in a pass between two cliffs. Jonathan is not afraid of the overwhelming odds. He is acting in faith. The only people facing this raiding party are himself and his armor bearer. And one of the verses that stood out to me in this passage is at the end of verse 6, where he says, nothing can hinder the Lord by saving, whether by the many or the few. Jonathan has astonishing faith. Jonathan believes in the power and sovereignty of God, but he knows it's up to God to choose. And before he said the sentence I just quoted, he said, perhaps the Lord will act on our behalf. He knows the Lord can help, but he knows the Lord may not. So he seeks a sign from the Lord. He and his armor bearer are going to show themselves to the Philistines and see what they say. If the Philistines suggest that Jonathan and his armor bearer go up to them, that they will take this as a sign that the Lord has given the Philistines into their hand. If the Philistines say, stay where you are, we'll come to you, then Jonathan and his armor bearer will know that God has not given them over. Well, the Philistines asked Jonathan and his armor bearer to go up to them. And so Jonathan advances in the certainty that the Lord has given them to him. And he and his armor bearer kill 20 men of this raiding party. God then struck the Philistine army with panic. They ran in all directions. Saul hears, and he can see what the Lord has done. But instead of jumping in and participating in what the Lord is doing, he counts his men to see who's missing. He sends the ark to inquire of the Lord, and then he changes his mind. And then he takes his men and goes to battle. And the Philistines are on the run. Now, Saul wants a decisive victory. He wants to avenge himself. He binds his soldiers to an oath not to eat until he gets the victory. He doesn't want to waste any time. This is all about Saul. Jonathan doesn't know about this. The men fight all day and are exhausted, hungry, and in need of food to regain energy. Jonathan sees some honey when he's going through the forest. He eats some, and he gets back some energy. The rest of the army do not eat. They become desperate for food. So when they're finally allowed to eat, they kill animals and eat them without draining the blood from them. This is against the law of the Lord. To keep the oath put on them by Saul, they got so desperate that they ate in a way that was against the law of the Lord. Saul has an amazing capacity to turn a victory into a disaster. Saul hears that the men are sinning, and he stops them, telling them to stop and kill and drain the blood before eating. The men sinned against the Lord, but Saul did not think that needed punishment, just redirection. But he finds out that his son has broken an oath that Jonathan didn't even know was binding on him, and Saul wants to put his son to death. His own oath that he put on the men is more important to him than the law of the Lord. He acted selfishly and with pride and did not consider how this would affect his men or his son. In spite of his intention to have his son put to death, the people saved Jonathan from Saul. Now, chapter 15, God sends a messenger to Saul through Samuel. God is going to judge the Amalekites for cruelty they've done to Israel in the past and ongoing cruel behavior in the years since. Saul goes to war against them and is to completely destroy them, all the people and all the animals. They have had 300 years to repent and have not done so. And Samuel says that Agag the king has made women childless. So this is a retribution, a just retribution against Amalek. And so Saul goes to war. He sends the Kenites away. They've been kind to Israel in the wilderness. And Israel attacks and defeats Amalek. But Saul saves Agag the king. Perhaps he wants to parade him around. We're not told why he did this. But he was told to kill all the people. And he did, everyone except the king. And he saved the best of the animals. So he's not willing to fully obey the Lord. I'm going to read a couple of verses from chapter 15, verses 10 and 11. Then the word of the Lord came to Samuel. I regret that I have made Saul king, because he has turned away from me and not carried out my instructions. Samuel was angry, and he cried out to the Lord all night. God is not changing his mind in terms of thinking that he made a mistake. Rather, when he says, I regret, he's using human words to try to convey emotions in ways that we understand. God is grieving over the choices of Saul, even though God knew it was going to happen this way. Samuel's devastated. He prays all night. Then he goes to Saul. And he finds Saul has gone to Mount Carmel and is setting up a monument in his own honor there on a hill. And Saul says very happily, I have carried out all the Lord's instructions. And Samuel challenges him, well, then what's with this bleating of sheep? What about those cows? And Saul says, the soldiers brought them from the Amalekites. They spared the best of the sheep and the cows to sacrifice to God. But hey, we destroyed the rest. Saul just doesn't get it. He sees himself as obeying, even though it's only partial obedience. Back to chapter 15, starting in verse 22. But Samuel replied, does the Lord delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as much as in obeying the Lord? To obey is better than sacrifice, and to heed is better than the fat of rams. For rebellion is like the sin of divination, and arrogance like the evil of idolatry. Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has rejected you as king. Now, those are strong words. The Lord equates disobedience to divination or witchcraft, and arrogance is equal to idolatry. Because Saul has disobeyed, he has rejected the Lord, and the Lord rejected him. Saul admits that he sinned, and then he quickly asks Samuel to go and worship the Lord with him. He doesn't understand what he's done. Samuel repeats that the kingdom is torn from Saul. And Saul says, okay, I've sinned, but please honor me before the people and come back with me. But Samuel refuses. Samuel then does what the Lord wants Saul to do and killed Agag. And then Samuel departs for his home in Ramah. This is the last time Samuel will see Saul. And worse, Saul never again heard from the Lord. There is a deathly silence from God to Saul from this moment on. Obedience is God's first requirement for those who will serve him. Do you want a recipe for successful living for God? Here it is. Hear the word of the Lord and obey it fully. What area of disobedience are you justifying by your own interpretation of the instruction of the Lord? Well, yes, I see that it says whatever, but, or, hey, God, I did what you said, except for this really, really, really little small bit, which of course you didn't really mean or don't really care about. Or, God, I did it this way because this is more logical. In what way have you disobeyed God? God doesn't want you to sacrifice for him in service, expecting his approval, while continuing to sin in some area in which you know very well what he has said. The service does not give us a pass on obedience. To obey is better than sacrifice. At what level is your faith? Are you Saul, sitting under a tree, paralyzed by fear and unwilling to act? Or are you Jonathan, knowing God can do anything, aware that how he acts is his choice, but being willing to go where he leads, no matter how outnumbered you might appear to be? God honored the faith of Jonathan by routing an army before just 2 men. God is a person with feelings. He is grieved by our disobedience. He regrets sometimes how we behave and where we have been failing to serve in spite of what he has given us. But he is sovereign in his decisions. He does not move from what he plans, for his plans are always best. Towards the end of chapter 14, there is a list of the battles Saul fought. He won those. In human eyes, he was successful. But in God's eyes, he failed. He did not obey. He was a petty king who thought he was all that and a bag of chips, but he was a failure. Jonathan, his son, never became king. He never reigned, although he seems to have been pretty well suited for the job, but he was successful in the eyes of the Lord because he trusted and obeyed the Lord. He knew the true king, God, and he listened when the Lion of the tribe of Judah roared. How do you want to be remembered? The key to successful life in the eyes of the Lord is obedience. John 14:15. If you love me, keep my commands.